What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors goes head-to-head with late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Denzel Washington sits down for what was supposed to be a routine interview, only to find himself trapped in an ambush that would leave viewers speechless and the entertainment industry reeling. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is the moment that exposed the dark side of late-night television and showed us exactly what happens when journalistic integrity collides with Hollywood arrogance. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans clash in what can only be described as the most explosive interview in late-night history. The Late Show studio felt different that night. Even before the cameras started rolling, there was an electric tension crackling through the air that the production crew couldn't quite shake. Stephen Colbert paced behind his desk during the commercial break, adjusting his tie with the kind of nervous energy that suggested tonight's interview wasn't going to follow the usual script. His producers had briefed him on the talking points, but there was something in Colbert's demeanor that suggested he had his own agenda brewing beneath the surface. Denzel Washington entered the studio with his characteristic dignity intact, nodding politely to the crew members as he made his way to the guest chair. The two-time Academy Award winner had done countless interviews over his decades-long career, and he approached this one with the same professional composure that had made him one of Hollywood's most beloved figures. But as he settled into the burgundy leather chair across from Colbert's desk, there was no way he could have anticipated the trap that was about to be sprung. The show opened with Colbert's typical monologue, filled with his signature political commentary and sharp-tongued observations about the day's events. The audience laughed on cue, but those watching closely might have noticed that his jokes seemed more pointed than usual, his delivery carrying an edge that hinted at something brewing just beneath the surface. When the commercial break ended, and the cameras focused on the interview segment, Colbert's smile seemed forced as he introduced his guest. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary Denzel Washington," Colbert announced, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a seasoned host. But anyone who knew Colbert well could detect the subtle shift in his tone, the way his words seemed to carry more weight than a simple introduction should bear. Denzel walked out to thunderous applause, waving to the audience with genuine warmth. He shook Colbert's hand firmly, settled into his chair, and prepared for what he assumed would be a straightforward conversation about his latest film projects and perhaps some light banter about his illustrious career. The first few minutes proceeded exactly as expected, with Colbert asking softball questions about Denzel's upcoming projects and his approach to selecting roles. "You've been in this business for over 4 decades, Colbert began, leaning forward with what appeared to be genuine interest. "What keeps driving you to take on these challenging roles?" Denzel responded thoughtfully, discussing his passion for storytelling and his commitment to representing complex characters with depth and authenticity. His answers were measured, thoughtful, and delivered with the kind of gravitas that had made him one of the most respected actors of his generation. The audience hung on every word, clearly captivated by his presence and wisdom. But then something shifted. Colbert's next question carried a different tone entirely, one that seemed to slice through the friendly atmosphere like a blade through silk. "You know, Denzel, you've built quite a reputation as someone who speaks their mind," Colbert said, his smile never wavering but his eyes taking on a sharper focus. "Especially when it comes to certain political and social issues. Some might say you've been quite vocal about your traditional values." The change in Denzel's posture was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders squared slightly, and his eyes narrowed just enough to signal that he recognized the shift in the conversation's direction. Years of experience in Hollywood had taught him to recognize when an interview was about to veer into uncomfortable territory, and every instinct he possessed was now on high alert. "I believe in speaking truthfully," Denzel replied carefully, his voice maintaining its steady cadence despite the obvious provocation. "I've always tried to be authentic in my public statements, just as I am in my performances." "Authentic," Colbert repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's interesting, because some of your recent comments about faith, family values, and traditional morality have raised eyebrows in certain circles. Would you say those views align with what most people in Hollywood believe today?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and the studio audience seemed to sense the subtle shift in energy. What had started as a celebration of Denzel's career was beginning to feel more like an interrogation, and the veteran actor's expression hardened almost imperceptibly as he processed the implication behind Colbert's words. "I don't speak for Hollywood," Denzel responded, his voice gaining a slight edge. "I speak for myself and my own convictions. I've been blessed with a platform, and I use it to share what I believe to be true and meaningful." Colbert leaned back in his chair, his practiced television smile never faltering, but there was something predatory in his gaze now. Of course. But don't you think there's a responsibility that comes with that platform? Especially when your views might be seen as exclusionary to certain communities? The word exclusionary hit the air like an accusation, and Denzel's jaw tightened visibly. This was no longer an interview about his craft or his career. This had become something else entirely. The audience, initially excited to see one of their favorite actors, now found themselves witnessing what felt more like a public trial than a late-night talk show segment. "I've never excluded anyone," Denzel said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent years being careful with his words in public forums. "My faith teaches love and acceptance. If people choose to interpret that differently, that's their prerogative, but I won't apologize for believing in something greater than myself." "But surely you can see how some of your statements might be interpreted as judgment," Colbert pressed, his tone remaining conversational even as his questions grew more pointed. "When you talk about traditional family values, when you emphasize the importance of father figures and traditional marriage structures, doesn't that implicitly suggest that other family structures are somehow lesser?" The trap had been sprung, and Denzel could see it clearly now. This wasn't about his movies, his craft, or even his charitable work. This was an ambush designed to force him into a corner where any answer he gave could be twisted into controversy. His hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, now gripped them slightly tighter as he prepared to navigate this minefield. "What I've said is that children benefit from having strong role models and stable family structures," Denzel replied, his voice steady but carrying a warning undertone. "I've never suggested that love comes in only one form, but I won't be shamed for believing that fathers have an important role to play in their children's lives." The audience had grown noticeably quieter, sensing the building tension between the two men. What had started as entertainment was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, and the energy in the room reflected that shift. Colbert, however, seemed energized by the conflict, pressing forward with the relentless determination of someone who had spotted blood in the water. But this was only the beginning, and neither man had any idea how much further this confrontation was about to escalate. The commercial break that followed felt like a momentary ceasefire in what had already become a battlefield. Colbert's producers huddled around him, whispering urgent instructions while Denzel sat in his chair, his composure intact, but his eyes reflecting the steel of someone who had been pushed too far. The makeup artists rushed to touch up both men, but the tension was so thick that even the crew members moved with nervous efficiency, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold. When the cameras rolled again, Colbert's demeanor had shifted into something even more calculated. Gone was any pretense of friendly banter or respectful discourse. His smile had taken on a razor-sharp quality, and his posture suggested a predator who had cornered his prey and was now ready to move in for the kill. "Welcome back," Colbert said to the camera, his voice carrying a false brightness that fooled no one in the studio. "We're here with Denzel Washington, and we've been having quite an illuminating conversation about values and responsibility in Hollywood." The way he emphasized the word illuminating made it sound like an accusation, and Denzel's eyes flashed with a warning that any seasoned interviewer should have recognized. But Colbert seemed intoxicated by the conflict, driven by some internal need to push this confrontation past the point of no return. "Before the break, we were discussing your views on family structures," Colbert continued, his tone taking on the cadence of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "But I think what really interests our audience is how someone with your influence reconciles those traditional views with the reality of modern America. Don't you think your platform comes with a responsibility to evolve with the times?" The question was loaded with implications, and Denzel's response came with a controlled fury that sent ripples through the studio audience. My responsibility is to be honest about what I believe, not to conform to whatever the current social pressure demands, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience navigating Hollywood's political landmines. I've seen trends come and go, but truth doesn't change with the times. Truth, Colbert repeated, leaning forward with theatrical interest. That's a bold claim. Whose truth are we talking about here? Because when you talk about traditional marriage, when you emphasize the importance of fathers in ways that seem to diminish other family structures, aren't you really just imposing your personal beliefs on others? The accusation hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, and Denzel's composure finally began to crack. His voice, when he spoke, carried a dangerous edge that few people had ever heard from the normally diplomatic actor. Let me be very clear about something, Denzel said, his words measured but carrying the force of a barely contained storm. I have never, ever diminished anyone's family structure. What I have done is speak about the importance of fathers being present in their children's lives, because I've seen firsthand what happens when they're absent. If you want to twist that into some kind of political statement, that's your choice, but don't put words in my mouth. The studio had grown so quiet that the hum of the cameras seemed unnaturally loud. The audience, many of whom had come expecting to laugh and be entertained, now found themselves witnessing something that felt more like a public execution than an interview. Colbert's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully provoked his target, and he pressed his advantage with ruthless precision. But surely you can see how your emphasis on traditional structures might be perceived as judgment, Colbert continued, his voice carrying a mock reasonableness that made his attacks even more infuriating. When you talk about the importance of marriage between a man and a woman, when you emphasize biblical values in your public statements, aren't you essentially saying that people who don't share those values are somehow living incorrectly? This was the moment when the interview transformed from uncomfortable to explosive. Denzel's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles showed white, and when he spoke, his voice carried the controlled fury of a man who had reached his absolute limit. You want to know what I think is incorrect? Denzel said, his voice rising for the first time since the interview began. I think it's incorrect for someone to invite me onto their show under the pretense of promoting my work, then ambush me with loaded questions designed to make me look like some kind of bigot. I think it's incorrect for a host to twist my words and misrepresent my beliefs to fit whatever narrative they're trying to create. The attack was direct and devastating, and for the first time since the interview began, Colbert seemed momentarily thrown off balance. But his recovery was swift, and his counterattack was even more vicious than his previous provocations. I'm simply asking you to clarify your public statements, Colbert said, his voice taking on a tone of wounded innocence that was clearly calculated to inflame. If you feel ambushed by being asked to explain your own words, perhaps that says more about the words themselves than about my questions. The implication was clear. If Denzel couldn't defend his statements, then perhaps those statements were indefensible. It was a classic media manipulation tactic, and Denzel recognized it immediately. His response came with the force of someone who had spent decades watching lesser men try to use similar tactics against him. Don't you dare try to gaslight me, Denzel said, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that was somehow more intimidating than shouting. I've been in this business longer than you've been alive, and I've seen every trick in the book. What you're doing right now isn't journalism. It's character assassination disguised as an interview. The accusation of gaslighting hit Colbert like a physical blow, and his mask of professional composure finally began to slip. His smile became more forced, his movements more agitated, and when he spoke again, there was a note of genuine anger in his voice that hadn't been there before. Character assassination? Colbert shot back, his voice rising to match Denzel's intensity. I'm asking legitimate questions about public statements you've made. If you can't handle being questioned about your beliefs, maybe you shouldn't express them so publicly. And if you can't handle conducting an interview without turning it into a hit job, maybe you shouldn't be hosting a talk show. Denzel fired back, his composure completely abandoned now. You invited me here to talk about my work, my craft, my contributions to cinema. Instead, you've spent the entire time trying to trap me into saying something you can use to destroy my reputation. The gloves were completely off now, and both men were engaged in a verbal battle that had moved far beyond the boundaries of typical television discourse. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply leave. This was uncharted territory for late-night television, and everyone in the studio could feel that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. But the confrontation was far from over, and what happened next would push both men past the point where any reconciliation was possible. Colbert's face had taken on a flush of anger that his television makeup couldn't quite conceal. The careful facade of the thoughtful host had crumbled completely, replaced by something raw and vindictive that shocked even his own production team. His next words came out with a venom that cut through the studio like a knife. "Let's talk about hypocrisy then, shall we?" Colbert said, his voice dripping with malice. "You want to lecture America about traditional values and family structures, but how convenient that you ignore the parts of your own industry that don't fit that narrative. How many of your colleagues live lives that directly contradict everything you claim to stand for? And yet you work with them, profit from projects with them, all while maintaining this moral high ground." The attack was personal now, designed not just to challenge Denzel's beliefs, but to paint him as a fraud and a hypocrite. It was the kind of low blow that crossed every line of professional courtesy, and Denzel's reaction was immediate and explosive. "You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about," Denzel said, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "I don't judge my colleagues. I don't lecture anyone about how to live their lives, and I certainly don't use my platform to tear people down the way you're doing right now. What I do is speak my truth when asked, and I treat everyone I work with respect and dignity." Respect and dignity, Colbert scoffed, his professional mask now completely abandoned. "Is that what you call it when you make statements that alienate entire communities? When you use your influence to promote views that many people find harmful and outdated?" "What I find harmful," Denzel shot back, rising slightly in his chair, "is a host who thinks he can ambush a guest and then act like he's some kind of moral authority. You want to talk about using influence harmfully? Look in the mirror. You've turned what should have been a conversation about art and creativity into a public lynching." The word lynching hit the studio like a thunderclap. It was a loaded term that carried historical weight and contemporary sensitivity, and its use in this context sent shockwaves through everyone present. Colbert's eyes widened with what looked like genuine outrage, and his response came with a fury that matched Denzel's intensity. "Don't you dare," Colbert said, pointing an accusatory finger across the desk. "Don't you dare use that word to describe being held accountable for your public statements. You came on this show as a public figure, and public figures get questioned about their beliefs. If you can't handle that, then maybe you should stay out of the public eye." "Question?" Denzel laughed bitterly, shaking his head in disgust. "This isn't questioning. This is a character assassination disguised as journalism. You didn't invite me here to have a conversation. You invited me here to try to destroy me on national television. Well, congratulations, you've shown your true colors, and they're uglier than I ever imagined." The studio audience had fallen into a stunned silence that felt almost oppressive. What they were witnessing had moved so far beyond normal television discourse that many seemed unsure how to react. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared in fascination at the train wreck unfolding before them, but all of them understood they were seeing something unprecedented. Colbert's next attack was the most vicious yet, delivered with the precision of someone aiming for maximum damage. "You know what I think this is really about?" Colbert said, leaning forward with predatory intensity. "I think this is about an aging actor who's desperate to stay relevant in a world that's passed him by. You can't adapt to changing times, so you wrap yourself in this flag of traditional values and act like you're some kind of moral beacon. But really, you're just scared that your outdated worldview makes you irrelevant." The attack was so personal, so calculated to wound, that it seemed to suck the air out of the entire studio. For a moment, even Denzel seemed stunned by the sheer cruelty of it. But when he responded, his voice carried a quiet dignity that somehow made his words more devastating than any shout could have been. "You want to know what's irrelevant?" Denzel said, his voice steady but carrying the force of absolute conviction. "A host who thinks tearing down guests makes him important. A man who confuses cruelty with cleverness and thinks ambushing people makes him a journalist. You're not exposing anything about me. You're exposing everything about yourself, and it's not pretty. Colbert's face had gone from flushed to pale, and his hands were visibly shaking as the full impact of Denzel's words hit home. But his pride wouldn't let him back down, and his final attack was delivered with the desperation of someone who knew he was losing. "At least I'm honest about who I am," Colbert said, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't hide behind false piety and outdated moral posturing while secretly judging everyone who doesn't fit my narrow worldview." That was the final straw. Denzel stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had reached his absolute limit and would not be pushed 1 inch further. "False piety?" Denzel said, his voice rising to fill the entire studio. "Narrow worldview? Let me tell you something about narrow worldviews. A narrow worldview is thinking that anyone who doesn't share your political beliefs deserves to be publicly humiliated. A narrow worldview is using your platform to attack guests instead of celebrating their achievements. A narrow worldview is thinking that being cruel makes you clever." He began removing his microphone with sharp, decisive movements, each action a clear signal that this interview was over. "I've been in this business for over 40 years, Denzel continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience and hard-earned wisdom. "I've worked with people of every background, every belief system, every lifestyle you can imagine, and I've treated them all with respect because that's what decent human beings do. But I will not sit here and be disrespected by someone who thinks hosting a talk show gives him the right to attack people's character and beliefs." The microphone hit the desk with a sharp thud that seemed to echo through the stunned silence of the studio. Colbert sat frozen in his chair, his face a mixture of shock and something that might have been shame, though it was too late for regret now. "This interview is over," Denzel declared, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for argument. "I came here in good faith to talk about my work and my craft. Instead, I found myself facing a host more interested in destruction than dialogue. America deserves better than this kind of television, and I certainly deserve better treatment than what I've received here tonight." He turned to address the audience directly, his voice carrying the same commanding presence that had made him one of cinema's greatest leading men. "To everyone watching at home, I want you to remember something," Denzel said, his eyes scanning the stunned faces in the studio audience. "When someone invites you to their table, you expect to be treated with basic human courtesy. What you've witnessed here tonight is what happens when that courtesy is abandoned in favor of ambush journalism and character assassination." With that, Denzel Washington walked off the set of The Late Show, leaving behind a host whose credibility lay in ruins and an audience that had witnessed the complete destruction of what late-night television was supposed to represent. The cameras kept rolling, capturing Colbert's stunned expression and the uncomfortable silence that filled the studio like a suffocating blanket. As Denzel's footsteps echoed through the backstage area, it was clear that something fundamental had broken that night, not just between two men, but in the very fabric of how public discourse was supposed to work. The confrontation was over, but its implications would reverberate far beyond the walls of that studio, marking the moment when respectful disagreement gave way to something far uglier and more destructive.